So I'm going to go ahead and give him the introduction that he deserves. I am really excited to be here with my coworker, my colleague, and my friend, Dr. Frank Guevara. Dr. Guevara received his doctoral degree in early childhood education from North Central University. He completed his graduate studies in child development at San Jose State University and has a bachelor's degree in human development from Stanford University. Over the last 15 years, he's had careers in administration, several careers in administration, from managing programs across 4 states and just various sectors. He and his wife were licensed foster parents in Texas and North Carolina and have adopted children from foster care, private adoptions, as well as served as provisional guardians for children who needed a temporary home. Today, our friend Frank comes to us from Hawaii and is here to share his knowledge and his heart about foster care and adoption. Frank, thank you so much for being here. The floor is yours.
Welcome, everybody, and thank you so much for joining us as I share my experiences as a foster and adoptive parent, and hopefully provide some answers to some of the more frequent questions that we tend to get about foster care and adoption. Now, as I share my experiences, feel free to post your questions in the chat. My colleague, Dr. Simasek, is going to monitor that, and at the end of the session, we'll pick out kind of the highlights and top themes so that we can address those. But I do have to give a disclaimer. As Dr. Heald indicated, we were foster parents in Texas and North Carolina only. So that means our experience is not comprehensive or not representative of all foster families and parents. And so I'll give an apology if there's something that I can't answer at the end of this session, or if the information that I present may differ from your experiences, but I'm just trying to provide a little insight into what we have lived and what we've learned, and then share some information for those of you who might be interested in fostering or adopting as well. Okay, I'm going to go off video, but I will see you at the end. So let me start off by telling a little bit about my family. My wife and I, Donna, we met and we fell in love in San Antonio, and each of us had been married previously, but we came into our relationship without any children of our own. But that's something that we both really wanted. And for better or for worse, life had other plans for us, because we learned after our marriage that we could not have any biological children of our own. Now, keep in mind that both of us are professionals dealing with children and their families, and we were so eager to begin a family. So learning that we couldn't have our own children was devastating to us. And after a lot of reflecting and sharing and grieving, it came out that each of us had wanted to either adopt or foster after we raised our own family. So when we discovered that biological children wasn't possible for us, then our life took on a new direction. We began exploring what it would take to become foster parents. And ultimately, we were licensed by a private agency that contracted with Child Protective Services in Texas. Since then, we've had nearly 30 children in our home, some from as short as a few days, and ultimately to these 9 who are now our children through legal adoption, some from foster care and some from private adoption. And so this leads me to probably the most frequent question we get from people, which is some version of this: are those all your kids? Now, understandably, the average number of people in a family right now is just over 3. So when we're out in the community and you see a group of 2 adults and 7 kids or more coming out of a white passenger van, you're really not expecting them to be from the same family. And it was even worse for a while because we had purchased a retired Head Start bus and painted it black, just like the one that's pictured here. So you should have seen all the heads we turned whenever we pulled up into a restaurant parking lot. We'd get questions like, "Are you all from a church group? Oh, this must be a daycare, right? Or are you all on a school field trip?" No, it's just our big, crazy family. And this leads me to the second most asked question. How'd you adopt all those kids? How did you become a foster and adoptive parent? So I wanted to start off just by reviewing some of the foster care statistics, and then we could look at the requirements to foster and adopt, and you'll kind of get a sense of why this became our calling. According to the latest Administration of Children and Families report, the number of children actively in foster care has hovered right about 400,000 for the last 5 years. In any given year, however, nearly 700,000 children are served by the foster care system, which means that there are almost 300,000 children who move in and out of the system annually. That's a lot of kids. If we look at this graph, you'll notice that about 42% of children spend less than a year in the foster care system, which tends to be a good thing most of the time, but we'll talk about that in a little bit. And you may be wondering, now how old are the kids in foster care? So let's take a look at the distribution by age. You'll notice that just over half of all the children in foster care are 7 years old or younger, with the remaining 48% between 8 to 20 years old. And you may be wondering, well, why do we have children who are adults in foster care? But some children remain in care beyond adulthood because of their inability to care for themselves adequately at 18 years of age. And finally, we'll look at the racial breakdown. It may or may not surprise you that over 40% of children in foster care are white, followed by Black at 23%, and any Hispanic at 22%. And if you're curious about gender, they're nearly identical, 51% male, 49% female. But getting back to that question of how'd you adopt all these kids? I've highlighted here in green the fact that 45% of children placed in foster care are living with people they're not related to. You'll notice that over a third are living with relatives, and that's often called kinship placement. But the vast majority are with complete strangers. And the sad truth is that there aren't enough homes for all the children needing a bed. It may surprise you, but every night, hundreds of kids sleep in CPS offices, or they're moved to other countries or counties, or states because of the lack of licensed foster care homes in their communities. And when we look at the case plan goals, you can see that for over half of all children, the end goal is to reunify, to come back together with their parent or caregiver. And you may not realize, but it's a legal mandate in most states for them to make a reasonable effort for children to return to their biological parents. But for almost 30%, which is roughly 120,000 children each year, the plan is for them to be adopted. So you can start to understand why we've been crazy enough to adopt so many children. Because there are literally thousands of children needing a home. Okay, here's my last boring graph, but it really helps us understand the scope of adoption and how it falls between private adoption, the adoption that happens through the foster care system, and even international adoptions. And even though the last category gets a lot of attention in the media, it's a relatively small percent of all adoptions. So I know many of you came to this session wanting to know, with this question in mind, and it's the one that we get so often from people we meet: how do you become a foster parent? Because there's still a shroud of mystery surrounding the whole foster care child welfare system. And each state has different requirements, but I've tried to capture some of the most common threads today, just to give you a glimpse. Now, whether you're working directly with your state agency, child welfare, child protective services, health and human services, whatever it's called in your state, or you could be working with a private organization, and that's how we started. But they contract with the state. So ultimately, all children are the responsibility of your child welfare agency, and either they are placed directly from CPS or child welfare, or they're placed through a private organization. But you have to apply to become a foster parent. And the process all begins with either you submit an application or you complete some sort of orientation. And it could be one or the other that happens first. Sometimes you'll even be asked to attend an informational session before you submit the application, because some people won't even follow through after they understand all the steps, all the requirements, all the regulations that takes to become licensed. And some people can be automatically ineligible, as we'll talk about in a little bit. The next big requirement is that all future foster parents must pass a background check. And so to do that, each adult in the home is fingerprinted, and those prints are run through both the FBI as well as your state criminal database. If you've lived in multiple states within a 5 to 10 year period, you might have to have a state criminal check of those other locations where you have lived. And those fingerprints are also run through the child abuse registry. So some people, like I said, might be disqualified because they have a criminal past. Things like assault or abuse will automatically disqualify you from being approved to become a foster parent. But if everything comes back clear from the background check, then the agency, whether it's the state agency or your private agency, is going to conduct what's called a home study. And that results in a comprehensive report on each adult individual and the family as a whole. Let's say my wife and I, and we have a couple of kids, they're going to have a report about those 4 individuals. So they're going to ask about your own childhood and your upbringing. They want information about your occupation. They really want to know why you want to be a foster parent. They're going to ask How do you handle conflict or stress? How were you disciplined as a child? If you have children of your own, what is your discipline style and process? And other similar questions in order to paint a picture of your fitness to take on this awesome responsibility of being a foster parent. They'll also ask for the names of several references of individuals who can attest to your ability to provide a safe, stable home for these children. And they're also going to do an inspection of your home to make sure that it meets the state regulations. It's things like, do you have fire extinguishers and fire alarms? Have you created an evacuation plan in case of severe weather or fire? Have you put steps in place or protocols in place for protecting and safeguarding medication? As well as the living arrangements. Are they going to be appropriate for the number and ages and needs of the children that you'll be licensed for? And after that whole interview process happens, then you receive this home study document, which you can take from agency to agency, state to state. It's kind of like your resume as a foster parent. The next step is to complete any required training that your state requires. It could be anything from just a couple of hours to several days worth of information. And if any of you have watched the film Instant Family, then you got to see a snapshot of some of the training topics that might be covered. Things like typical child development, the factors that result in children being in foster care. You'll definitely get information on child trauma and how that presents and the types of behaviors you might see when children are placed with you. Things like health and safety, appropriate guidance, and the like. And one of the last components is an interview in which you discuss which placement you're willing to accept. Do you only want to be a foster parent, or are you looking to ultimately adopt a child from the foster care system? Would you like to have an infant, preschoolers, or maybe teenagers? Or are you open to all ages? Are you open to a sibling group? And if so, how many? Are there any preferences in terms of gender or race? And they'll ask you about the service level you would be willing to take on. And I'm going to discuss that in just a little bit. Ultimately, they're looking to ensure a good match between you and the children placed in your care, because stability is key for these children, because they've had their world turned upside down, and sometimes multiple times. Again, the regulations vary from state to state, but I wanted to share a few more requirements that are common. There's usually some sort of age requirement. Agencies want to know that you have some financial stability. During the home study process, they'll determine the maximum number of children for which you're approved, but generally the rule of thumb is 1 child per bed and no more than 6, unless you're going to be licensed as a group home. We mentioned those health, fire, safety inspections previously. And now some states and agencies have requirements in terms of marital status. There's some agencies, oftentimes with a religious background, that require individuals to be married. There are some agencies that support same-sex marriage. There's different agencies that will license for individuals who are not married, but all of that is going to vary depending on your state and the agency that you're working with. So if that's something that you really need to know, you would need to conduct research for your specific location. They also want to know if you're in good health, and that's part of the interview process, your medical background, and if there are any terminal illnesses or chronic diseases that could result in your passing. That could be a disqualification because, again, they are wanting to have a stable forever home for these children. And obviously you can't predict the future, but that could be a red flag if there are some medical concerns. And finally, you'll need to agree that you will not use any physical discipline as a foster parent. And that's particularly important because many of these children are moved due to abuse. So you may have figured out by now, because I've thrown it around here and there, that to become a foster parent in your state, you will actually earn a license. Much like if you're opening a daycare center or a center, and that license will indicate the number of children that can be placed with you, as well as any restrictions on that license. In this example here from Utah, the license permits the placement of 2 youth clients who are immunized. And on this one, it's valid for a period of 1 year. When we were licensed, we had a license for 5 years, and we could have up to 5 children. But again, it's going to depend on your home study, interview questions, the size of your home, how many beds you can accommodate, and your preferences as well. Okay, now another question we get about is, kind of how do you afford it? Do you get paid? What's this all about? And there's some, media headlines that have been made about foster parenting and people in it for the money and blah, blah, blah. Now, since we're a big family, people ask, how can you afford to feed so many people? And yeah, it can be challenging sometimes when you have 9 kids sitting down for breakfast. Okay, we go through a whole box of cereal and a gallon of milk. But if you only have 1 to 2 children, then obviously the expense is going to be much less. But regardless of how many children you're licensed for, the state is required to pay you a daily rate based on the service level of the children. Now, keep in mind that on the whole, a child in foster care is not your typically developing child. The fact that the state had to step in should be an indication to you that these children have experienced some trauma. It could be abuse, physical, sexual, verbal. It could be neglect, physical neglect, academic neglect. It could be drug exposure. Or it could be a combination of 1, 2, 3, 4, or all of these things. Now in Texas, these are the current daily rates for the 5 levels of need. And each child is assigned a service level. So remember when I said earlier that during the interview, they'll ask you what type of child you're willing to foster. This is part of what I was referring to. You'll have to think long and hard about the types of behaviors, the medical, social, educational needs that you are committed to supporting. For a child at the basic level, this might mean things like they act out occasionally, or they have challenges adapting to the surroundings. So in your classrooms, think about those children who are frequently on yellow, or they may have several check marks next to their names when they're at school. The ones who need to go to the quiet corner to self-regulate pretty frequently. So that's where we start out, basic. And we see that currently you receive a little over $800 per month for that child. Now, for a child at the moderate level, you can anticipate more frequent violence, risk to themselves or to others, but it could also be some type of impairment in communication or a medical condition that requires constant support. For us, this has included children who are diagnosed with ADHD, oppositional defiant disorder, bipolar disorder, and who are on medication. Children at the specialized level would have a severe impairment, maybe suicidal behaviors, or multiple disabilities. It could be a child who's confined to a bed. We fostered a little girl who was removed because of shaken baby syndrome. She couldn't eat independently, so we had to provide formula through a feeding tube. She was partially blind, and it was unclear if her cognitive function would improve. So that's the kind of needs a child might have at the specialized level. And intense means just that: extremely aggressive, frequent self-harm, drug addiction, being unable to complete self-care, or they might be on life-sustaining medical devices. And children at the treatment level are usually in a residential facility for things like being chronic runaways, diagnosed for severe intellectual disability, psychotic behaviors, or things like that. And if you're wondering about, does my insurance cover that? Know that children who are in foster care automatically received medical insurance from your state, like Medicaid. So you don't have to worry about those hospital medical expenses. Now we get a lot of questions. What's it like to be a foster parent? And in some ways, it's just like being a biological parent. And in many other ways, it's completely different. A lot depends on how long the children are in your care. It can depend on what their permanency plan is, as well as, just like we were talking about, the types of children that you foster. So on the one side of the spectrum, you could have a newborn at the basic level who would be fairly typical to parent. And contrast that to a teenager who has gone through multiple placements, maybe requires antipsychotic medications just to regulate their mood, and who engages in self-harm. That's going to be very different. And something you may not even realize is that we have some colleagues that all they do is provide respite care, which means that if I, as a foster parent, need a break from that psychotic teenager who's engaging in self-harm, I can contact other foster parents who do respite care and drop off my foster children at their home for days at a time to get a break and be able to come back and provide the quality, loving care that they deserve. But some other people do respite care for other reasons. You might need to travel out of state. And that happened to us one time. We had a death in the family, and so we needed to leave Texas, but we had children, foster children in our care. And a judge has to approve travel outside of the state because it's illegal to transport a foster child across state lines unless a judge has approved it. And for multiple reasons, there's a lot of hesitation to approve out-of-state travel because of oversight concerns. And just looking at the numbers that we talked about at the start, there's just such a backlog of cases in family court that need immediate attention that trying to get a judge to fit in consideration for out-of-state travel, it's just very challenging. So you could be a respite care provider and your life as a foster parent is very different than what most people typically think. Now, I love this quote from Elizabeth Stone, and I think that most parents can relate to her sentiment about being a parent. It's an awesome responsibility, whether it's to your own biological children, to adopted children, or to foster children. Their well-being should be your primary concern. But they're out in the world and you can't always protect them. Now, the tricky part when you're a foster parent is that these aren't your children. They have their own parents. And in general, as crazy as it might sound, the kids desperately want to be reunited with them. Even if they've come from abuse, neglect, they have that bond with their biological parents. And just like the caseworkers and police who come take them from their homes, the judges who sit at their big desks and say, you can no longer go back to them, and the attorneys who fight for their well-being, you are often regarded as the enemy. You're what's keeping them from going back and being with their families. So starting out, there's this incredible hurdle of trust that has to be overcome when you're fostering. And then stop to think about a child who has been in the system for a while, multiple placements. That lack of trust and resentment can be overwhelming. And you have to be there to step in and still provide a stable, loving, structured environment for them. Now, obviously, this is going to depend on the child's developmental level. An infant may not have that baggage of history that a preteen or teen has. But even imagine being an infant and being stripped away from their parent, even if they were a hurtful parent or a neglectful parent, and then being brought to some stranger's home for who knows how long. I'd be scared of you as a foster parent because I have no connection to you. And the last thing we learned, well, one of the things that we learned is that in spite of what we may already know about raising children, this is going to be different in ways that you weren't expected or prepared for. When we became foster parents, my wife had been a professional nanny for close to 10 years. And I had been a classroom teacher and then a director of early learning programs for about that long. And we were, and we still are, challenged with a capital C, challenged by the demands of providing a safe, supportive home to these children. Just like in that Instant Family movie, you may have seen a honeymoon phase where everyone's kind of acting nice. But when their true personality is revealed, you better be prepared for a lot of counting to 10 before reacting. At least in our experience, it's hard to prepare for something you've never known before. Here's the perfect example. We were licensed for 5 kids when we started, and we had told our caseworker that we wanted to start off with 2 kids who were preschool age or younger. So we got the call that there was a sibling group, a 2.5-year-old girl and her 10-month-old brother who needed a home. And so we agreed to the placement and we got everything ready for their arrival. The day they were supposed to be placed with us, we get a call from another caseworker that they just got in a sibling group of 4, 2 who were in elementary school and 2 preschool children. And they wanted to keep them together. Since we were only licensed for 5, we couldn't take all 4 of them. But would we consider taking the 2 younger kids? So in one afternoon, we went from being a family of 2, my wife and I, to a family of 6. Because how do you say no to a pair of children who need a home right now when you have a set of empty bunk beds sitting in that extra bedroom? Excuse me. Now, as crazy that might sound, the part that really shocked me was the process of getting children placed with us. When you're working in a program, you might get some enrollment documents, maybe a visit from the family. And if you're lucky, there's even a transition period to get to know one another. But here's how it went for us. The first caseworker arrived with the 2 younger kids. They sat down on the sofa and they said, "Oh, this is so-and-so, and here's his sister so-and-so. Here are your guardianship paperwork. Sign here. Here's their stuff. This placement might be for 4 months, maybe a little bit more. I'll let you know once I hear more from the judge. Do you have any questions? Okay, great. I'll check in with you next week." Gone. 30 minutes later, the second caseworker arrives with the 2 older kids. Same introductions. Here's your paperwork. Sign here. This time, I don't know how long this is going to be. I'll call you tomorrow, but I got to go pick up some other kids. Gone. Talk about instant family. And let me tell you, that was the longest evening of our lives because we knew nothing about these kids, what they like to eat, their preferred activities, what they know how to do, their bedtime routines, anything. And I remember thinking to myself, they just gave me 4 kids, just like that. And we had to figure it out fast. A million questions runs through your mind. Do you need to sign up for daycare or enroll them in school? Are there medications you need to worry about? What about food allergies? Are they potty trained? Do they know how to feed themselves? For older kids, you might need to get school uniforms, a backpack, school supplies, and then figure out what they can and can't do in terms of grade level work. Maybe they already have an IEP. Some kids, when they're placed, they're going to have their own electronic devices or cell phones, and that's their personal property that you cannot legally take away. How are you going to handle that in a way that aligns with your parenting ideals and still honors their past? Have you thought about what TV, movie, music, or video game guidelines you're going to establish? We've had children placed with us, 3 and younger, who've watched scarier movies than I've ever watched. And you've probably never had to worry about food issues like many foster parents have to. There's a hilarious scene in the Instant Family movie where the foster parents are trying their best to get the young girl to eat a nutritious meal, but it quickly spirals into a meltdown because she wants her chips. Food can be a big trigger and issue for some children, especially if they come from situations of neglect where food was scarce. We were told in our training to just keep a bowl of fruit out on the table or the counter and let the kids know that they could take some anytime they wanted to in order to help overcome food insecurity issues. And yeah, we did that. But even if you do that, we've learned that some children will still want more food and may turn to stealing and gorging on what's in your pantry. We've found empty boxes of Ritz crackers, the empty sleeve from a whole loaf of bread, countless peels from oranges, bananas, apple cores, empty peanut butter jars, and more hidden away under beds, in closets, under the bathroom vanity, and at the bottom of clothes hampers. They tell you about this in the training, but it was still, and it's still a shock until you actually experience it. Much like becoming a parent, fostering is full of surprises. My wife and I have been blessed to share in the joys, the sorrows, and growth of many children. Some who were lucky to have become an integral part of our family. But we've also had our hearts broken. After fostering an infant for 9 months with the expectation that we'd be able to adopt him, the judge decided to let him go back to his bio mother. It was like mourning the death of a child. For better and for worse, he did return to us 3 years later. But the trauma he experienced in those 3 years is something that we continue to work through today. We've learned so much about the child welfare system and have been surprised by the occasional Facebook message from a child who thanks us for the time spent in our home. Let's take a quick look at how you make the transition from foster care to legal adoption. Now, there are a lot of steps that need to happen before you ever get to adoption day. Each state has slightly different sets of regulations, but this flow chart will give us the basic process from when a child enters the foster care system because there's some cause for removal, abuse, neglect, drug exposure, something like that. When at all possible, states prefer that children are placed with relatives because it's seen as less disruption for the child. But if a relative isn't able or willing, then that's when you would step in as a foster parent. During this time, the judge approves a reunification plan based on the recommendation from the Child Welfare Agency of what the parents must do to have their children returned to them. Maybe they need to find stable employment or secure adequate housing. They might have to complete parenting training or undergo drug rehabilitation. It could be that they serve out their prison sentence successfully. Each case is different, but the judge sets the goals in a time frame, as well as identifying what supports the state will provide to the parent to help them achieve these goals. If the parent is successful, or sometimes at least showing adequate progress, then the child is returned to their family. But if the court deems that the parent is still unfit to care for their child, then parental rights are legally terminated and the child becomes a ward of the state. And this is when caseworkers recommend a permanency plan. They look for relatives again, foster parents, or maybe an institutional setting that will provide a permanent home for this child. In fact, we've been contacted and have adopted former foster children because of the bond we had with them years previously, and because there were no other suitable alternative placements. All of these avenues are explored with the end goal of recommending adoption. So if you're lucky, and if it's something you're planning to do, getting to adopt your foster child or children is one of the happiest parts of being a foster parent. Here's a picture of our first two boys that we adopted from the foster care system alongside the judges who decreed we were now a family. Many times there's a whole bunch of families who finalize their adoptions on the same day. So there's a big celebration to commemorate the event. And I wish I could say that after adoption day, everyone lived happily ever after. But sometimes an adoption doesn't work out. It could be that the adoption process was rushed. It could be there wasn't full disclosure of the child's needs. We know of some cases of international adoptions where the orphanage lies about the child's age or that the child's parents are dead when they aren't. And sometimes it's just a mismatch between expectations that the parents have and the child. So in some circumstances, a child who was adopted is put back up for adoption. My wife consults for an agency called Second Chance Adoptions that specializes in matching children with new families because their adoptive home didn't work out. And as a matter of fact, our eldest daughter was adopted under those circumstances. And right now we're in the process of finalizing adoption on two other children from similar situations. So there is hope for these and all children in foster care, as long as there are people, hopefully people like you, willing to open up their homes and their hearts to give a child a forever home. Before we get to the Q&A section, I did want to share these resources for those of you who would like to learn more about foster care and adoption. And I believe my colleague is going to be posting this in the chat, so you can download it as well. Okay, I'm going to